Hello, thank you. I'd like to just take a minute to thank the Yingge New Taipei City Museum and its supporters and all the staff and managers at the museum. Also, special thanks to Director Cheng and to my fellow jurists. And thanks to the artists who applied to the competition and everyone who's in the audience. And also a big thank you to the translators who are bridging the language gap here. We really appreciate your work, and you've done a stellar job on the last two lectures, so it's great. So thank you very much. So it's been quite an education being here. It's the first time I've been at a international competition. And first time I've juried one as well, obviously. So in November, after a pretty productive and enlightening experience as a jurist for this competition, I left Taiwan with an assignment from the director to address this topic of contemporary currents of ceramics. I also left reflecting on the jury process and the final selection of work. And because it was my first experience at an international exhibition, you know, my reflections, I think, come from a bit of a distance. They don't come from someone who's been inside of these situations. So I put together a few of them, I guess in essence, to develop the talk. I just followed these kinds of questions I had, or these observations I had. And in some ways, it was a little bit, I had this image of sort of, you know, when you try to cross a stream, when you're walking out in the woods, and you look for stones, sort of finding one stone and then finding another and kind of making your way across a stream. And of course, that imagery is very related to this idea of a contemporary current, you know, because a stream or a current actually sort of is liquid and it moves. It kind of comes up against, you know, resistance, or it sort of flows faster when it goes through narrows. So that image seemed, in the end, pretty apt. But some of the questions that came up, and I really appreciated Lin Ping's, Director Lin Ping's, talking about where questions come from. Semantically, and she said, you know, questions come out of a particular place, they come out of language, and they come out of culture. And these, while I don't see these questions as rhetorical, they probably have more than one answer, or maybe they're not answerable yet. Am I talking in the mic okay? I'm not used to holding the mic, so just, I'll have to relax with that. So here are a few of the reflections. What do international ceramic art competitions measure? What do they measure? How can an international competition ensure it lives up to its claim of being international? What work or type of work is seen, and seen consistently, in these competitions, and what type of work is not seen, or seen rarely? Are the goals and the point of view of the various countries that host these competitions distinct? For example, what is distinct about Taiwan's international exhibition? Because Taiwan is Taiwan, and Taiwan has a unique historical and contemporary story that situates it uniquely in the world. Might it not have a different goal than an exhibition, say, in Korea, or an exhibition in Europe? Is there a danger of international competitions being too focused on trend and only attracting work by privileged makers versus representing greater diversity by including less visible or less trending work, or more regional work that is just as socially, politically, and creatively relevant? Artists and jurors notably reoccur in these competitions. Are there too many international competitions? Too many fish in a small pond? Or do the hosts of the competitions make a big pond too small? So while those thoughts were swimming around, I was faced with this deadline of an abstract for this talk. And all of those things ended up distilling into this phrase, international regionalism. And it's a somewhat paradoxical phrase, but it's a phrase that seemed to help me think about the relationship between the creative work that I see in international competitions and the greater creative ecosystem. So during this process of trying to unpack my response to this experience, I just pulled a few entries out of my notebook, and this is what I came up with. So the first one, we fill in what we don't know with the limits of what we do know. This woman, Banaji, is a social psychologist who studies implicit bias. There's nothing original about groping around in the dark if you can reach out and turn on the light. That's James Trilling, and he's talking about knowing your history. How do we measure creative success as individuals and as a culture, in a culture that has a growing incapacity for nuance? So this is a comment about just information and access. That's Maria Popova. She is a writer, thinker, and she has a blog called Brain Pickings that you can subscribe to. And she's really talking about how do we pay attention. Vibrant Matter by Jane Bennett. Vibrant Matter is the title of a book. The subtitle is A Political Ecology of Things. And it discusses the agency of stuff, how stuff sort of moves in the world outside of our own will. In the sense, the way objects and things start to operate based on their own agency. And then finally at the bottom, just contemporary, that word contemporary. What does that word mean, really? We use it a lot. It's got a few kinds of definitions. Does it mean visible? Could it mean invisible? Does it mean relevant? You know, what does the word contemporary mean? So this was another image from my notebook, and again, just still unpacking this language of this phrase international regionalism. And these are actually definitions, you know, so international being, you know, distinct entities that interact. So it's a particular paradigm. Things are separate and they interact. Global is another related word, but that has to do with integration, which is very different than interaction. And then regional, not centralized, distinct. And then there's this language of ecology and economies came up for me as I was thinking through this, in part because I think these words point to complexity. And we're often talking in more abstract or theoretical terms and thinking about things singularly, but they're very linked to larger systems. So this note of complexity, I think, is really essential to acknowledge. And complexity is in the actions and gestures like interact, integrate, intersect, connect. You know, this is the place that complexity lives. But of course, if you're going to make a connection, you need to have something to connect, right? You need to have difference. You need to have this and that so you can have connection. You can't just have connection if there isn't any difference. I was looking also into this language of just economies, or again, just systems of stuff in the world. And this was one economist's interpretation. And so he's sort of looking at reading this left to right in terms of history in the past, and looking at this as the present economy and also top to bottom. So you can look back in time at sort of cultures that were based on economies that were agrarian. The system they used was farming, earth, and then these different categories, knowledge off his head. So this is sort of the human element. And he's talking about the contemporary economy of being a human economy. So it's human, it really needs individual motivation and incentive and ingenuity to actually generate humanity. And that's sort of, the humanity being defined as this place of creativity, passion, character, collaborative spirit, but he really sees this as a vital contemporary economy that's driving culture, driving civilization now, in this era. At least that's our potential. The creative ecosystem. So the creative ecosystem is a very complex ecosystem. It's larger and more complex than an international competition can really represent, regardless of how many people apply. I must admit that international regionalism is a phrase that I conjure to hold my belief in complexity and probably to really hide my fear of losing it. I have a fear of homogeneity. I think that it's this idea of blending and equalizing is troublesome, that we need to learn and develop how to be able to live with difference. And I wouldn't want to combine the seductive power of large prize money and the inescapable human bias of juries, because there is inescapable human bias, only to have it perceived as authoritative and accurate enough to judge what is worth being made. Does that make sense? If you have a lot of money in a sort of a big, powerful situation and a jury, there could be perceptions that that's some kind of authority. Complexity and difference together with connection and intersection is at the heart of my experience of critical making and critical thinking. And that brings us closer to the matter at hand, the creative ecosystem of ceramics. So to the list of questions I delivered at the opening of the talk, I eventually added, what is the relationship between education, learning, academic or other, and the work we see not only in these very visible platforms of international competition, but also in the greater creative ecosystem of ceramics. So with international regionalism and all the accompanying fears as inspiration, I brought images of a very small slice of recent student work that comes out of the region of North America and out of one school's approach to education in the ceramic arts. And it's an approach that's born out of the history of ceramic art as it occurred on that continent in this world of nations. First, disclosure. Professionally, I identify as an artist and an educator. I am not an artist who has a teaching job. And I think I was taught by some people who are artists who had teaching jobs, but I am definitely an artist and an educator. And this is some of my background. The continent I live on is North America. My nationality is Canadian, at least that's my passport. Second generation. I'm a resident of the United States of America, and they have my status as a resident alien. The geography, the landscape of my imagination is the prairies, the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, although I live in the east of the United States now. My profession is a ceramist. My genre and research is functional pottery. Profession also is educator at Alfred University. My title is a professor of ceramic art, and yes, I have other identities as well. Ideally, one might have to lay out a full history of the development of ceramic art in North America and look through the 20th century, where ceramics is largely and very specifically influenced by Europe and Asia, but that is not this talk, so I won't be doing that. There's not time here to do that. This is also not a compare and contrast talk. I have taught primarily in the United States and Canada. I'll state my experience, and I'd be very interested also in hearing your experience about education and how you think through it and practice it for those that do. North American education extends well beyond the walls of academia, obviously, but in North America, exposure to academic training is often some part of a professional ceramist experience, even if it's just taking workshops or going to lectures or panels that come out of academic practice. So the work that I'm going to show you is primarily work of the so-called millennials. So this is Generation Y, it's another term. These are the students that are graduating now out of my school. So they would have been born, you know, mid-80s to mid-90s, depending where we are in that range. And it's essentially defined as the generation that was entering adulthood around the millennial year 2000. They're sometimes called the new boomers. And I think there's a handful of them in the audience. As a group, I don't really sit down and look at the nomenclature given to generations of students very often, but I do really recognize this group. I recognize a shift in my classroom in the last 6 years in particular, and I experience this group is very motivated, very entrepreneurial, very collaborative and dynamic in their thinking, and very ambitious in terms of their hopes of building up a humanist part of a human ecology, a la the earlier slide. And this is a group of, this is the latest graduate class, so this was in April. There's a couple of them missing, but we have 8 grads a year. And the sign they're sitting in front of the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. So the New York State College of Ceramics is a school that has, a college that has 2 schools in it, a School of Art and Design and a School of Engineering, and it's primarily ceramic engineering. Regardless of external world influences of content, in the end, the basic structure of education is linked to a region's cultural, social, and political values, and cultural and political histories. That's not to say that it can't be restructured. It certainly can, and society and education definitely change each other. But it does become linked to that. And so what goes on at Alfred is at once North American, but it's also very much about being in the state that it resides in. The School of Clayworking was started in the 1900s to promote industry in that area because agriculture was not in good shape. The soil wasn't good. Well, the soil wasn't good because it was full of clay. I'd also like to say that social and educational issues obviously impact each other. So negative issues like sexism, classism, racism, if they're in the culture, they affect education. Educational institutions can also be places these issues are effectively addressed, as most schools have democratic goals and intentions. They have diversity goals, they have affordable education goals, they have equality goals. If I were to state the list of the outstanding characteristics of education in ceramic art, from my experience, I would start the list from one, multi-genre or mixed genre programs. So by that I mean the programs that include the long-standing genres of sculpture and studio pottery, or call it fine art and fine craft. There's different nomenclatures depending on who you talk to. And growing programs that include ceramic design and interest in architectural design as well. And then of course they also include the intersections between these realms. Secondly, the programs are strongly rooted in skill building and material knowledge. I call this critical making. At Alfred, it's heightened because we are a material school. The state established that school to promote industry in the area. So it was looking at people training to start small factories of ceramic tile making, for example, but they were really looking at skill building and materials. Three, programs strongly rooted in critical thinking. Critical thinking is an essential part of the education system. And I'll talk a little bit about that more as we go along. And then four, intensive teaching. A high level of faculty-to-student contact and student-to-student interaction. And the contact is of a particular nature. It's very focused on education and advancing discourse and research in materials and research and thinking. At the undergrad level, we're a non-major program, and we have divisions in the school. So there's painting, there's drawing, there's photo, there's video, there's sound, expanded media, sculpture, dimensional studies, etc. We have all these areas, and the students come into these areas, and they work. The expectation is that they work deeply into these areas, that they develop critical making and critical thinking skills. There's no majors, so they can connect areas. But what we don't do is encourage them to sort of float through everything. What we are not is a interdisciplinary school, in the sense that we're not throwing you into classrooms where there's 5 different genres bombarding you. We're putting you into areas that have a lot of expertise. So when you come into ceramics, you're working with faculty that have a lot of deep expertise in different realms. When you go into painting or print or video, you're working with faculty that have deep expertise and deep histories. The students then can put these things together, but there's an expectation of a level of critical thinking and critical making that comes along with it. Okay, so. I'm sorry, this thing just, the way it's designed, it just looks upside down to me. Okay, so, I don't know, can you see that very well? Or should these lights be dimmed a little up here? I'm not sure. Director Lin Ping was talking about how mild ceramists are, and I'll tell you, these students aren't very mild in my experience at all. But they are really hard working. So this first group of students are, these are images of people that graduated just now. The name is cut off a little bit down there. I don't know if you can shrink the image a little bit on the screen. But this is Bailey Arend, and what I'll do is just talk a little bit about each artist, maybe bring up a few things about the program. And if you have questions about a certain artist's work, if you just jot down the name, and then at the end we could go back into that. and talk about what's going on. So Bailey came into the program with a real strong sciences background. He had an undergrad degree in sciences and had picked up various art programs. And he actually came in making art objects. And what proceeded to happen through the course of his study is that the objects he was making were just increasingly burdened by the scales of his very overt physical gestures. He's from Alaska, he's a cyclist, he's a hiker, he's just a very physical person. So he literally just was overbearing with the objects he was making. He mined his own clay locally, again going back to the history of the school, and slowly over time, and not immediately, but over the course of about 3 semesters, the object disappeared from the room and his body came in place of it. He then went forward to do some performance where he was sitting, performing the work, but that was actually not a very comfortable situation. So this is what he ended up with here, and what you're looking at is a drawing using this clay. These are clay blocks on the floor, and there's a video of him making that drawing. And this piece on the wall is a different drawing that he made by rubbing his body with charcoal, and then this is an angle that he hung onto and hung from and trained himself to just swing along the length of the wall without falling down. And so what you see is just his body coming up against the wall. He was really, the way it works at Alfred is you're working with a group of faculty that are trained in the area, but then all of the faculty in the whole art school are graduate faculty. So he was also working with faculty that were more involved with performance and dimensional studies. He became very influenced by Alison Krauss's seminal writing, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, etc. The other thing I think that goes on with the graduate students is they're very active teaching the undergrads. And in many ways, I think that the way his work developed was very influenced by being in the classroom with undergraduate students, partly because his education didn't include those types of classes. So in some way, he moved through training in the genres by being a teaching assistant. This is Hannah Thompson, and she had her show with Bailey. The title of this show was Depth Perception, Illusions of Reality. So it's really difficult to read. Can we dim the lights up here a little bit? Both of these artists were actually dealing with the phenomenology of perception, reading the Maurice Merleau-Ponty book about perception. And she was dealing with perception and illusion. And so these are ceramic cones. She worked a lot with photography. So this is actually a photograph, and this is a tile. And she was taking paper. Let's see if I can get a. So, for example, this is a flat ceramic tile that's leaning against the wall. So she was taking paper and crumpling it, and then she would straighten it out, and then she was spraying pigment across the surface of the paper to pick up the creases and the crevices and the landscape of the paper, and then taking that and making a print of it on a ceramic tile, very thin ceramic tile, and then also using that paper to make photographs. So this is a flat surface, but it's the image of this crumpled paper. And these are just cast cones that, again, are, all of this is done with color. So she worked out a color scale, a gray scale, and sprayed these cones to reflect that. So they actually appear to be changing color through the light. This is Virginia Torrance. Before I talk about this, I'll just, at the very end of the talk, I have images of 6 a piece each for the six core faculty that work there. And I guess I would say there's no token teaching that goes on at Alfred. So there's 6 core faculty, and all of them work in very distinct genres. So it's not like somebody who doesn't practice something teaches it, you know, at the undergrad level. So if you're a potter, you would, at the undergrad level, you teach in that realm. Sculptors teach in sculpture. At the graduate level, of course, advising happens across the genres. And so all of the students are expected to be very well versed across all genres, regardless of what they're specializing in. There's also a couple of technical specialists who help run the facility as well. And of course, there's relationships with the Ceramic Engineering College with technical assistance and research as well. So this is Virginia Torrance, and you know, the question here is about ceramic work that is not ceramic, and I think that Professor Wu brought this up too. So this work that Virginia's making, these are tiles, they're roughly this big, and she's got these slabs that she lays out on the floor, and she literally, without tools, just claws her way into these forms and makes these shapes. And they're very they're very psychological, and in some ways they make me think about just the therapeutic aspect of clay. You know, she was reading a lot of Jung, for example. There's a wonderful new book, I don't know, some of you may have it, by Jenny Sorkin. She just put out, it's called Women, Ceramics, and Community, I believe is the title. I'm reading it right now. And she talks about just the post-war therapeutic teaching that went on in clay. And I know people want to run from that because they're scared of that feeling too pedestrian. But it's really interesting how this artist mined it conceptually. Well, so she was making these things out of clay. But then, you know, they really ended up being about memory and loss. So in the end, these are actually plaster casts. The positive was made in clay, and then she began casting those in plaster, and then casting a plaster positive. So in essence, you know, these things really needed raw clay to be made. Everything about them is clay. But in order for the content of loss and absence, also the content of monumentality, which comes up in some of the work, in order for that to come through, they really needed to be made in plaster, another material. For them to remain in clay, there was too much presence. So she actually needed the absence of the clay. Now, you know, is this ceramic work, is the question. You know, we're often concerned, or we often have these parameters of, well, this is a ceramic exhibition, there has to be so much percentage of clay in it. I think I read something in this prospectus about there had to be so much clay in their work. Well, this clay is conceptually and physically, essentially ceramic, but it happens to be rendered in plaster. So does it qualify? So here were some of the deeper blocks. She titled some of these pieces. I'm sorry I don't have titles for all the work, but literally had just gone into the archives, and the artists hadn't, the librarians hadn't put all the documentation in when I pulled the slides out. So an example of a title for this one would have been, it would have been untitled, and then in parentheses it would say seat. So she would give you the image of an object like seat, or seat is also a verb, to seat yourself or to be seated. She would give you that image, but she would untitle it. So she's really sort of both moving you towards a certain content, but pushing you, you know, sort of pushing you back. So I would say this is another artist, Emily Duke. I would say that the critical making and the critical thinking is really the opposite of sort of the old school, post-war more master-student teaching that was going on in North America, like the Peter Voulkos, sort of the Guy Club of Peter Voulkos, where he would go in and make his work, and all of his students, male, would work around him, and they would learn by being in the presence of this great artist. Critical making, critical teaching is different than that. There's actual expectations of material research, there's expectations of critical discourse, there's a lot of student-teacher contact, as I said, and also, we would never, this actually came up at lunch, Ronti asked me, would you encourage your students to apply to this competition? No, absolutely not while you're a student. It's a very short period of time, you need to be in the studio doing research. Yes, pay attention to what's going on in the world, but don't pay attention so hard that you're measuring your every move against it. You really need to be paying attention to your own primary research. So Emily Duke, she's another one that really is using a lot of different materials in her work, obviously looking at the scale of what she's doing. This board that's sitting here, it's 12 feet tall. This is actually a painting on canvas of this tile in which she's taken a lot of aggregate ceramic and put it into a castable and ground it down. And the painting is a painting of a section of this that's enlarged. And I think that this type of so she's also playing with scaling. She's using digital imagery, printing banners. There's some large banners in her piece she prints. But she's dealing with the concept of scaling. And of course, scaling is the primary sort of maybe gift or sort of application of digital tools, that something can be scaled with fairly high fidelity. And she's playing with that, but she's actually doing it in an analog way. So it's a certain commentary on the contemporary tool, but not by using it. She's actually doing analog scaling. Sorry about that, didn't find that image. This is Will Preeman. I probably need to just go a little quicker. This is Will Preeman. So Will, I call this design-informed sculpture. Will is really a designer, and when he came in, he was working with a lot of different materials. He proceeded to work with quite a few, but also made quite a bit of work in clay. The title of this exhibition is called I'm So Happy to See You. He's really a brilliant sort of formalist in terms of, just physicality of work and scale and color. And he uses these very disarming, sort of dumb-looking forms. But the skill in this is quite exceptional. And I think some of the emotional experience of the work is very intense once you're in the room for a while. So you walk into the room and it's very bright and it's very engaging, but it can become incredibly, the word is cloying. I don't know what the translation is, but it's very kind of weighs on you after a while, starts to just feel heavy in the end. This was a gum wall. This also maybe is another very ceramic-like thing. But he started a collection that many of the students participated in. So everyone who was chewing would know to take their gum and put it on this wall. So this went on through the duration of his graduate studies. And of course, it's a very ceramic-looking piece, and it was quite beautiful surface. And ended up inspiring some of the other surfaces that went on in the exhibition. What you see spinning in the background there is a gold swastika that's made out of cheerleading pom-poms. Here it is still. And this is an idea of how this work operated. The piece it's really beautiful when you're watching it spin. You know, the way the gold drapes, and then it comes up and it falls and it goes. So you stand before this, and it's utterly satisfying and lovely to be standing before this, and at the same time you're standing before a swastika, and you sort of are hit with this experience of engaging in something that's actually quite troublesome. Now, one thing to understand about these students I'm showing you is that we're looking at this group, a very small section of people, in a little slice of time. So Gustav Hamilton, actually Will Preman was the year before Gustav Hamilton. So they're watching each other, right? You know, they're in a small studio and they're impacted by each other. So the closer in time you get, you start to see connections between the work, either by work becoming interested in similar paths, or by really reacting against each other, one or the other. So this is Gustav Hamilton, and his premise for making was that he was an artist, so I make art. And basically his work really sort of reflects on itself as art. So this is a photograph from a street in New York City, Matthew Marks Gallery, and it's put on a window blind. So when you walk into the gallery, it looks like you're looking out a window and that you're on a street in New York. And then the duck decoy, this is actually a print of water that he made that's sort of sitting in front of this. And again, when you just come into the gallery and you approach the work in a certain way, you can buy into the illusion, but the illusion very quickly dissolves. There's the Matthew Marks New York Street window blind. He also made these books that you could handle for Gustav Hamilton, so all the accoutrements of a famous artist. These are some of the ceramic pieces that he was making. And these tiles, the tiles were actually made from objects that were around him. So the work really made itself. For example, that image there is the image of a pot he made as a student. And then it's printed on a poster, and then that poster is put on top of a pedestal. So it's this very self-conscious making of art making. It's very sincere. It's not ironic. So it's not about a negative critique on art. It's really about just a contemporary awareness of being an artist. And he also was, earlier on in the work, just very directly using the internet. So for example, he would make a piece, he would post it, and there was one piece in particular where he got a like from a pretty well-known critic, and so then that piece became somehow more valued than other work. So he's really trying to unpack this condition he finds himself in as making the stuff and also watching himself make the stuff, if that makes sense. So this is an image of his studio, and these are all, like this tile here is this, right? So the work keeps making the work, keeps making the work. This is an image of, again, a little dog model he made when he was a kid. And that's the last piece of his work. The Ken Price cup. Jesse Ring was a colleague of Will Preman's, and he was in the studio at the same time. I think, what's notable in some of the work, I won't talk too much about Jesse's work, is just some of the gravity of the skill in the work. So he's modeling these pieces here, and then he was also working with the digital print media faculty in the building and working with prints. A lot of the content in his work is is quite biographical. It's also based in theater, etc. But there was this whole sort of group of these individuals that were working on a lot, very image-intense, narrative-intense work. Sort of literal use of props. There's figurative work that goes on. This is Jen Daggs. And then also just showing off campus. So this is one image. This is an image of her setting up her work off campus at this, a teaching fellow that we had at the school has rented this church space and turned it into a public gallery. So that's one image. This is another artist in that same space. You know, it's a very overbearing space, but just getting the work out of the more, for some of the people, out of the more pristine galleries into these other kinds of spaces. This is an old post office. This is Kate Roberts, and Kate's just going now to work with Doug Jeck and Michael Swain in Washington. But just working with the quality of this space, which has been transformed through a number of artists working in there. And she's making these very ephemeral sort of beads and sort of this current or flow of matter on the form, and then also working with these very classic forms. A lot of the content she was dealing with was biographical. It had to do with coming out of living in the South. You know, some of this work mimics the moss that would grow on the trees out there. So she was 2015. Henry Chrisman, he sort of was doing a lot of social SEA, socially engaged art. He drove an anagama around the country. People would fire it at various places. He made this publication. This is it, right here, that he took up to his car and drive around, and he could fire it to cone 10. One of the things that we often talked about in his work was just this, just the style of this writing. And it was something we never really got out of him in terms of like taking full conceptual responsibility for it. It's like, why does it look like that? And we never, you know, he graduated and we didn't get it out of him. This is a terracotta house, which was a sample of all the that had samples of all the terracotta tiles in the area at the time. You know, clay as being able to mimic. This is Jason Siegel, and what you see here is actually this is actually a print of a surface. So it looks like it's actually a material that's been worn down, layers of material worn down, but it's actually a digital print of that. And Jason was dealing a lot with just the, you know, ideas of imitation, multiplicity, and what is real in terms of ceramic, which is a great question for that material. This is a potted plant. So you can see, it's not too apparent here, but you see the front that has the image, and then this is the back of that plant. This was an exercise he would often do in his studio that, again, is very based in this idea of ceramic mimicry, but it doesn't use any ceramic. He had a roll of tape and a pencil, and through time, he slowly took all of the material off the pencil and built the tape, and removed the material from the tape and built the pencil. Does that make sense? So the pencil, the tape looks like a tape roll, but it's made of pencil, and vice versa. A very ceramic process, or something that comes directly out of ceramic. Here's a close-up. You can see the eraser from the pencil in here, and there's still, you know, remnants of the original tape roll. This is Zimmer Beiner, who has a very strong vessel-based history, but also is identifies sculptor, and sort of teetered on how to move his work initially. And then Laura Ashley, who identifies as potter. So I think, you know, I'm sort of probably going too slow and run out of time in a minute, but But I just want to move into sort of the other genre that's represented in the school, which is studio pottery. I think it's a very, pottery is made in obviously different ways in different parts of the world, and the way that it grew up in North America and is what it is today is very particular to that history, which I won't talk about right now. But this is Lydia Johnson, who graduated in 2016, and Lydia was just very, sort of very clear about just this tactile, very direct response to function. She was a collager, a two-dimensional artist, and she works a lot with color in the end and has started to work a lot with pattern. But Lydia's in conversation with Gus, of course, and all of her other colleagues. And the students are expected to be in very fluent critical discourse around all the genres. And it's great to see the way a formalist like Lydia can teach a conceptualist. She just flashed the 10-minute sign. Can teach a conceptualist or a sculptor about just how something should really read in its structure, and also the way the sculptor can challenge the potter around how something really sits in the world, or the way it sits in the world, or the way it occurs in a gallery space. So Lydia might be directing her work here. This is ArtStream. You may know about ArtStream. It's sort of this mobile gallery that Allegheny, one of our earlier MFAs, and that's John Gill, one of my colleagues. This was a cake at Ansika celebrating their anniversary. There's an image of the ArtStream, ArtStream 2.0, Del Haro, where they're highlighting more of the sort of printed ceramics. And also sort of looking at the entrepreneurism of studio pottery. So these are two, Yumi Hore, a really well-established ceramist in the country and beyond, and also a very recent up-and-coming hotshot Sean O'Connell. Just the entrepreneurism, the guerrilla shows, these collectives that crop up where students get together and develop marketing tools together. It's really thriving in a way right now that's pretty exciting. There's also people like Mark Shapiro who have apprenticeships. There's fewer of those, but there are some. And then people like Carter, Red Clay Rambler, what's his name? Ben Carter, who has this great podcast where he's putting together this tremendous oral history of artists in the country, and he's also a potter in his own right. So this whole world of ceramics, it's something you never see in the Biennales, but it's a thriving in North America. Blair Clemo, who's working as an educator, dealing with ideas that move between decoration and decorum. There's also this aesthetic that you see in this work, which is this pinching, this kind of, this pinching quality. You see it in a lot of sculptural work yet. It can come off as sort of looking like a de-skilling move, but it's also, I think, a way that analog work really communicates on the internet. When you see an image on the internet of a pinched pot, you actually see touch. In a certain way, it elevates it. So this is the next piece that we're working on at Alfred, and I'm actually soliciting any suggestions who wants to offer, is how we pull this into the program. The faculty's turning over there. We've got new faculty that's come in, and we're looking at how to put the design piece into the program. We're looking at both studio-based design, which is design that comes out of moving materials, but also architectural design. So we're searching that position soon. We do have a joint program in China at CAFA in Beijing at the City Design School. And this is really a program for Chinese students, and some of our students do exchanges. But we're really invested in China in an educational way. We're not going over there to get our work made, but we're going over there to really engage in education. This is Chung Mao, who was one of our grads, and he designed this APEC table service. So that was a pretty proud moment for him to get an image of that with President Obama. Heather May Erickson was a teaching fellow. We have a teaching fellow position that turns over every 3 years. She brought design into the program. She's American trained. And a lot of our students end up working in this realm in the few opportunities that are in North America. Heath Ceramics, for example. They bring digital tools into play. So this person was milling metal, milling wood, milling molds for casting her pieces. So it's living in a certain way, and we're just trying to, a country that sort of let go of a lot of its design industry, we're trying to just gain a toehold in terms of how to bring that back. The methodology is there, but it's just really the design thinking part that we're trying to pull back into the program. Tile, architectural tile, but also looking at architectural, other kinds of architectural opportunities in ceramics. This is a grad, Kayla Stein, and this is some of her work that sort of pushes down a bit of a design path. Albion Stafford, Peter Pincus. Actually, there was some Korean work that this guy's, he needs to go to Korea and sort of pick up some of those chops. He's doing some beautiful work, and of course it's very novel in North America. I'm just thinking we should do an exchange program with our students. But the colored slip, the casting, and then there's architectural terracotta that's being made down the street from us. So this is Boston Valley Terracotta. There's a residency program. It's in a trial run this semester, this summer, and it's run. One of the principals of it is Joshua Stein. You might know him. He's an architect who's working also with clay. This is all ceramic, so this is one of their buildings, all ceramic panels. And Del Haro, who's also one of our former grads, is working with Joshua on this. And again, this idea of working with multiples, which is essentially what this is. This, which is a building, is this. And again, just designing on a small scale and a smaller scale, and then scaling up. So you should look up this guy and look up Radical Craft. It's pretty interesting stuff. So scaling is being a primary opportunity in terms of digital practices, but the other word is fidelity, and he talks about fidelity. Fidelity is just resolution, right? So when you scale this up, you lose resolution. As an artist and an architect, Joshua Stein is very interested in those places where you lose resolution. Andy Brayman, another one, Matter Factory, he graduated a while ago, always interested in tools, and these are examples of some of his work. Table Space is an exhibition that I curated several years ago. It's online. You can look at the catalog, and it sort of brought into relation this range of functional ware that gets made, everything from Ole Jensen's work that he actually has produced in other factories, Paul Catula, who's producing his own work out of a studio, to sort of these, funky handmade ceramics of Carrie Radish. There's Paul Eshelman, who's had a long time pottery casting earthenware, and then, of course, designed work like Mark Ferris. That's all one of a kind. So we also had Tomo Hamada's son, who showed in this show. So we just looked at the whole range of influences on studio pottery. This is an undergrad who graduated recently. This is all flameware, and he's also making these hanging systems for his work. So these are BFA students, very young. Courtney Chaplin, BFA. This is actually not her thesis show, but an installation she did. Recent grad of mine, Anna Liam, who's making these spoons, but also dealing with ideas of marketing. So a lot of the video and the boat and the rice is set up to allow you to conceptualize the act of using the spoon in this formal space. So close-up of that. Jess Detweiler. Akira Tao, again, undergraduate student, porcelain bricks. This is actually a sheet of water on clay. This is a current junior, Conrad, doing a table service assignment for a junior pottery class. Alex Smith, who's now designing cars for Ford. And then this is the position you might find yourself in a junior sculpture class or a pottery class. They also learn to build electric kilns. So here there's wiring the circuitry for electric kilns, and of course building gas kilns as well. And all sorts of other technical classes in digital or analog. Okay, so this is an image of some of my work. So just to conclude, if I go back to a few questions at the beginning, how can the international competition ensure it lives up to its claim of being international? Well, you know, they sort of cast out a call and then people apply. It's not like the World Fair model where every country was invited and every country had a pavilion. And it's not like the Olympics where all the genres might be invited. It's a slightly different format. But I think these things are interesting to try. And you know, the essential question that I asked about what do international ceramic art competitions measure? You know, perhaps they measure the same human industry as the great Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. This, after all, in some way, is the precedent. I think there's challenges around them. But ultimately, I think that these competitions are really places of connection and intersection and interaction. And that, you know, as long as they can support difference, I think they can really be a powerful and positive force in the ceramic scene. And then just the faculty at Alfred, Linda Sikora, new faculty Linda Sorman, new faculty Matt Kelleher, 3-year teaching Turner Fellow Chase Folsom. It's a piece of Matt's work, sort of slab billet work. Linda Sorman's sculpture, Chase Folsom. And then Andrea Gill's still on faculty. She's retiring after this year. We're searching for, as I said, ceramic design, architectural design. Walter McConnell, who maybe you saw here a few years ago. The wonderful John Gill. Wayne Higby. And this is Wayne's new office space, the new ceramic museum at Alfred. Okay, thank you.